Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Well, hi, and welcome back for another episode of the Examined Life with Phil. This is going to be part 2 of my discussion with Peter Rasor on Molinism in reference to the problem of divine foreknowledge. If you haven't already listened to part 1 last week, I do recommend that you go back and listen to it, because obviously just when you have a 2-part discussion, it makes more sense to listen to the first part first. So this time around, we're going to mostly spend a lot of time talking about the other viewpoints and how Peter would react to them. And so just go ahead and listen in, and as always, write in and let me know what you think. I hope you enjoy the second part of Peter and I's discussion. Okay. Well, that I like your response there, but it brings another objection to mind. I guess you could call this an objection to your response. That was cleverer in my mind before I said it out loud. Oh well.
This is a defeater, right?
yeah. I thought it was going to be something like that, but it didn't really work.
Yeah.
So, why then would it be the case? It seems to obvious just from reading Scripture and our own practical experience in the world that there are people who reject God and reject God for all eternity, who wind up away from Him, not like getting too deep into like hell theology, but who reject Him. Mm-hmm. Well, then why wouldn't God arrange the world in such a way so that everyone comes to Him? If we're seeing that He does this, that He can both, in a certain sense, determine, not in the strong sense, but in the sense we've already talked about, and that we have free will, why didn't He set it up so that everyone comes to Him? Because it says in Scripture that that's what He desires, and it certainly seems, at least on the face of it, possible. There isn't anything prima facie incoherent about that concept.
Yeah. Well, the question itself that you ask, and I've thought about this myself as well, it assumes that there is a possible world that God could have created in which everybody chooses to accept Jesus Christ freely.
Yeah, it's assuming that's a possible...
that's a large assumption. How would we ever know that, first of all? Second of all, it's quite possible that that's not possible. The typical Molinist, from my understanding and from what I've heard, is they think that this is the best possible world that God could have created that brings about the greatest number of people to accept Christ. And so God did do the best thing by creating this world, because this is the one in which the most people are going to freely turn to Him. This also gets into the question of what about those who haven't heard? Well, my perspective is that God knows who will freely choose Him and those who will freely not choose Him. So let's say there's an African in the bush that He knows will never freely choose Him, even if he did hear about Christ. Well, then God's not, obligated to make sure that person hears about Christ, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, because He's still going to freely choose against Christ, even if he did hear. Well, how does He know that? Well, middle knowledge. He knows that if this person X was in position Y, situation Y, that he would reject Christ freely. And He knows across the board those who would do it every single time, and those situations in which they would freely choose. And my opinion is that those people that will freely choose in certain circumstances, God makes sure that those certain circumstances arise and that they will hear the gospel so that they will have the opportunity to freely choose Him. So,
okay. So you would say that it is the case then that there are some people who just are never going to choose for God, no matter what. I think Planiga has the term for them, like trans-world depravity or something similar to that.
Yeah. And that I think there are some people like that. I really think that at the end of the day, there are some people, it doesn't matter what circumstance they would ever find themselves in, they would freely reject Jesus. And so in those situations, God is not obligated to even have them hear the gospel. Now, they may, but they may not.
Okay. Yeah, I'm kind of with you on that reply. I more just wanted to hear what you were going to say and let listeners hear that objection in your reply too. Sure. The other way I've heard some people explain it is you can draw a distinction between what's logically possible and then what's actually feasible. And I've heard William Lane Craig make the distinction this way, where he says, well, it's entirely possible in the strict logical sense that Hitler could have given one of his addresses while standing on his head. But is that feasible? Well, no, come on. That's just never going to happen. And so you could then say that, well, it might be possible in this big logical sense, or it might be possible in the strictly logical sense that God could create a world where everyone chooses him, but then it might not be actually feasible. It could be like the Hitler standing on his head example, where we can say, well, there's not incoherent. We can't say that's impossible in a strict sense, but come on, is it going to happen?
Yeah.
No.
Well, it's actually stronger than that too, and I would suggest and highly recommend that people, if they want to look at this particular point more in depth, to read William Craig's subject there on feasible worlds and the only wise God, because you give the example of Hitler, which is valid. It's a good illustration. I understand we're trying to make it as easy as possible to understand, but it's actually stronger than that, a lot stronger than that, because when you look at a world in which free creatures are making decisions, bringing about events and circumstances, all sorts of things that go along with that, you actually get to a point to where there are only certain worlds that are feasible for God to create, or else you end up with contradictions. And so I do believe that there are only certain worlds that are feasible for God to create. And so I think that would also be a valid response to the question of why doesn't God create a world in which everybody freely chooses? So that would be my 1B. My 1A was the first initial one.
Okay.
But I would also give that response as well, because I think you do end up with contradictions. I think Craig does a good job at showing that.
Okay, good deal. Well, those are really the only two objections I've ever come across to Molinism. Are you aware of any other ones, or not just like hand wave, the poor dismissals that people always give to various views, but are you aware of any other good objections that people give, or is there anything else about it that gives you pause?
No, I really don't. The only other objection that we haven't discussed is with open theism. Open theism says that God can know only those things which he can know. And so they would limit God's knowledge of the future, because they would say future statements or propositions don't exist. They're not knowable.
Yeah.
I find that philosophically false. And Craig does a great job explaining this, why that's false. But it gets into tensed statements and propositions and stuff. And if you take out the tensed part, the statement is either still true or false. For example, let's say in 2020, Donald Trump will be elected for his second term of president. Now, how would I know that? Well, the statement as such is either true or false, right? In the year 2020, Donald Trump will be elected to his second term of president. I mean, that's either true or false, right? I mean,
it's going to happen or it's not. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't think future statements can't be known because they already have a truth value. And if they have a truth value, then they're known by God. So I think the whole idea that future statements and propositions can't be known is false, just based on that. But I do want to give sort of a response here, because I think this is really important as I thought about this. There is sort of a unique view that Cottrell actually puts out. So we dealt with, you mentioned classical theism, we just mentioned open theism, you dealt with Reformed sort of compatibilism, Calvinism, and now of course we're dealing with Molinism. But Cottrell sort of comes up with his own view, and it's very interesting. He describes it in his book, God the Creator. So if you're interested, you can take a look at that book. And it's how, and it's in the discussion where he discusses God and time, and he has his own little unique view. It hasn't really spread very far. It's pretty much confined to his thought and to his classes and what he's taught over the years as a theologian. But what's really interesting about it is what he says is that God doesn't have foreknowledge until he creates. So this is different than Molinism in the sense that with Molina, God has middle knowledge the whole time, even from all eternity, even before creation. But what Cottrell does is he makes it after the creation decree, and then he has foreknowledge. And now this is different than open theism, because open theism says they have foreknowledge at all. But you would recognize that really this is just a step back from open theism. So it's just open theism back a step, because God doesn't always have this future knowledge. Now, here's the thing.
Would that be, I'm sorry, just to clarify, so would his view then be that God gets all this knowledge like at the first moment of creation, or is it more like
as soon as he
has to wait until I'm born before he knows what I'm
doing? No,
do?
he knows it as soon as he creates.
Okay, the first moment of creation.
And the first moment of creating Adam and Eve and everything else, and that whole package, the whole beginning of creation. Now he has foreknowledge of what's going to unfold. But here's the thing. When I was going through all these different scenarios of trying to understand foreknowledge and free will, what ends up happening with that particular paradigm, which is so interesting, is Molina discussed that specific paradigm. And in his critique in the book, in the Concordia, which is where Molina discusses his middle knowledge and everything, he actually says if you place God's foreknowledge after the creation decree, what you actually get is determinism. And the reason why is because once he creates and puts everything in motion, now if he wants to do something providentially or bring about plans that involves human beings in their decisions, if a human being doesn't decide in accordance with what he needs to occur, what he has to do is trump that person's free will decision and make him do something. Now, think of the whole history of humanity in the universe. God is going to have to do this a lot.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, a lot. So actually what's interesting is this particular view, the very thing that Cottrell, and I respect him a lot, he's a good friend of mine, but the very thing he's trying to protect, libertarian free will, is actually turns into determinism. And so that's why I ended up rejecting that particular view. Now, what's interesting is I also came to the conclusion, I don't know if this is right or wrong, but I've, in my own mind presently, I've come to the conclusion that open theism, the very thing that they're trying to safeguard, which is libertarian free will, it turns into determinism as well. Because if God doesn't know the future, guess what he's doing? If he's going to bring about anything according to his plans, he's going to have to start trumping people's free will in order to bring about certain situations and events.
Well, maybe I'm not quite following you here. The way I've heard open theism described, I've read a couple of books. Like I'll confess, even though I think he's wrong on most things, I love reading Greg Boyd's works because I just find him to be an enjoyable writer to read, and he's kind of takes that viewpoint. And the way I've kind of heard it explained is more that it's like, well, God doesn't know the future because, like you're saying, it's something that can't be known. It's an incoherence like a square circle or a married bachelor, so obviously he can't know it. Well, they might not say it quite like that, but that's the general idea. So then he's just making really, really, really good and sophisticated guesses, because just like kind of like how you and I are going to make a good guess that the sun's going to rise tomorrow. Might turn out we're wrong if the universe ends between now and then, but come on, we're right. So come on, God's right. So I'm not quite following how you get from that to determinism. Can you explain that a little more?
Yeah, let me see if I can articulate it a little bit better. I understand the open theist perspective, and I understand exactly how you described it. That's how I've understood it. Like he's the best chess player in the universe, right?
Exactly, yeah.
But here's the thing. Is there any way for God knowing 100% certainty what somebody will do?
Under that view, I don't think so. No, you could get like 99, maybe 99.9, but
let's say you even get 99.999999999%, right? Let's say you're just awesome because you're God, right? At the end of the day, he's still going to be wrong somewhere, right?
Yep.
Okay, well that's a problem, isn't it? I mean, if we just look at it from that standpoint, if we just purely look at it from that standpoint, that's a problem. But secondly, even if a God is really good guesser, there is still going to be at some point that God, to ensure that something that he has planned comes about, he's going to have to trump someone's free will at some point, because he's going to be wrong. He wants, let's say, Judas to betray Jesus so that Jesus will get crucified for the sins of the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, does he know Judas will definitely, 100% certainty, will deny Christ and hand him over, and betray him? No, he can't in open theism. All he's got is like the best computer program, the divine mind with all the different chess pieces, and people's decision is going as best and understanding as best as he can. So what would happen if that happens to be at one of those points that God was wrong and Judas doesn't betray Jesus? Well, he's going to have to trump Judas's will and make him betray Jesus.
I see. Okay, yeah. I see. So at some point or other, God's going to have to just step in and override and make things go. I see. Yeah. And you
the very thing that open theism is trying to protect, at some point, to what extent, that's up for debate and philosophical thinking, but at some point, he's going to have to trump someone's free will and override it so that he can accomplish his plans and his goals.
I see.
At least one.
And this would go even further than him like influencing people through like miracles or things along those lines. Then where he would.
Because they're we can all envision or conceive of a person who, no matter what God says, Judas is going to say, "No, I hate you, God. I'm turning this guy in," or "I refuse to do what you say." But God's like, "No, you have to deny him and betray him, so I can have my son be crucified for this." I mean, somewhere, some way, in human history, someone is not going to cooperate with God's plans, freely.
Yeah. I can see that.
He's going to have to trump that person's free will in order to accomplish it. So, somewhere open theism is going to have some sort of accommodation for God trumping someone's free will and determinism being true somewhere, and to some extent.
Okay, yeah, I can see that now, yeah. Okay, well, you've pretty much dealt with open theism then, which was kind of next on my agenda to deal with the other views. And we've danced around talking about the Calvinist reform view a little bit, but what I've found is generally, like you said earlier, they kind of accept the argument for theological fatalism and then redefine free will to be, well, you just do what you want to do.
Right.
And so, although we've kind of hit on a little bit, could you just articulate why you don't find that view satisfactory?
Yeah, two reasons. One, do we always do what we most want to do? I don't.
I think it depends on what you mean by that, because
that's the thing, right? I mean, technically speaking, it depends on what angle you take. I mean, honestly, I as a Molinist could say, well, actually, I can almost agree with that because, I mostly do what I most of the time I do what I most want to do. Yeah. But how is that not libertarian free will? I mean, you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
But then at the end of the day, I mean, there are times that I don't do what I most want to do. There are times that I go against everything within me because I just know it's the right thing to do, even though I don't want to do it at all. So I think that's not correct. But even more so, what I find interesting is they'll try to avoid it being deterministic. At least a lot of the ones I talk to, the compatibilists, they're like, no, this isn't hardcore determinism. Well, actually, it lapses into hardcore determinism because you have to ask yourself, where does the desire of doing what you most want to do come from?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It comes from.
Does it come from
me? Yeah.
Does it come from you? Well, your compatibilist, your Calvinist won't say it comes from you. They're going to say it comes from God. Well, if it comes from God, that's divine determinism, right? I mean,
yeah, I would think so.
I mean, so it doesn't make any sense to me. It's just very contradictory and incoherent. So that's why I find it very unsatisfying. It just lapses right back into determinism. Because if my desires of my will don't ultimately come from me, then it's not libertarian free will, and it comes from without me. Well, it's some sort of determinism. If it ultimately comes from God, which is what your typical Calvinist theologian would say, then that's divine determinism. I mean, because I'm not making the decision.
I think in some senses that's kind of confusing metaphysical ontology, wherein everything is grounded in and comes from God, because he's the very essence and nature of everything. He's being with a capital B, with something more, you might remember the other term. It's confusing that with questions of knowledge and agency, where I'm stumbling over my words here, I apologize, but it's trying to say, well, because God is the grounding of being with a capital B in ontology, he has to be, we have to look to him immediately and directly for everything else. Kind of, I had an example in my head, now it's going away. Kind of like how you could say, because the ultimate authority in the United States is, at least in theory, the United States Constitution, when you get pulled over for a speeding ticket, you want to say, well, where's that in the Constitution? No, you've confused categories there. Although that's where the laws are ultimately grounded and found, you might have local laws that are kind of more loosely and indirectly based off of the Constitution. Is that a good analogy, or did I butcher it there?
Yeah, I'm not really sure of how to quite understand that. I mean, I understand what you're saying with the Constitution and the laws, because the Constitution obviously gives freedom for police to be established and then laws to be made and for the police to enforce those laws. And those are all given to the states by the Constitution. But I'm not sure how that parallels what the Calvinist Reformed would say. I actually just had a discussion like this past week, and I honestly was trying to figure out what in the world he was saying. I honestly don't understand it. He was saying it's not determinism, and I was like, well, how is it not determinism? And he was trying to give an explanation just basically similar to what you were trying to say. And I was like, okay, maybe it's not like full-blown determinism where God's determining everything, but it's deterministic.
Yeah, it definitely is. Yeah,
it's definitely deterministic. Okay, I think your average Calvinist would say God ordains everything, so therefore it is a full-blown determinism. But at least with human beings, because that's our topic, is at least deterministic in that sense. Because if I'm doing what I most want to do, it may not be divine determinism, but it's still deterministic in some sense. Because the one main thing that they always argue for is that there's some sort of causal link. They say that if somehow if we believe in agent causation, then somehow I'm just making arbitrary decisions. That's their objection, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is silly. I mean, that's what it means to be an agent, is that we contemplate and think. We don't have to be causally influenced like dominoes in order to make a decision. I mean, we're not a tree in which wind blows a tree and the tree falls over. Now we might be influenced.
I just thought of a. So go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Go ahead. But so I just don't find that appealing at all. I still see it as deterministic. If it's not a full-blown determinism, it's at least deterministic.
Oh yeah. I just thought of it. Maybe this is a better way to make the example I was trying to make, where it's sort of like, but they're saying that God has to determine everything, and then we as people don't get to determine things. Like I think I would think it's both, that you and I determine to at least some extent what we're going to do. You determined, hey, I want to come on Phil's podcast and talk about Molinism. I determined, hey, I'm going to invite Peter on to do this.
Right.
And obviously there are obvious limitations on this, like I can't walk outside and flap my arms and fly, because it doesn't matter how much I will or determine or want that. That's just not possible. And other things along those lines. And there's obvious influences that come into play, like I might want to eat some food if I smell it cooking, and if I hadn't smelled it, I might not want to, and things along those lines. But what I think they're trying to do is they confuse this or don't recognize that just because God determines things doesn't follow that I don't also get to determine things. Or I want to say it's both. God determines things, and so do I, and so do you, and so do everybody else, where they kind of want to say, only God determines things, and that's the
Yeah,
confusion
that's
or
the
mistake
rub, right?
that's the example I was making. I was trying to get to, but
Okay.
I don't always make
Your
the
explanation there
analogies
was
I
a lot
make
better.
don't
Yeah.
always work. So
No. Your explanation there is much more clear to me. One is full-blown determinism, right? God determining everything.
hmm
And then I believe that God does determine some things, right? But I don't think he determines everything. I would say there's definitely a difference there. And I think biblically we would have to agree, if we put on our theologian caps here, we would have to say that God does determine some things, right? I mean, obviously he determined to create. No one had the freedom in doing that except God himself. Um, God determined. I mean, Acts chapter 4 says specifically that God's predetermined plan was to send Christ. Of course, he also
yep,
based it on his foreknowledge. It says there, but there's a lot of determining that God does, but it doesn't mean he determines everything.
yep, exactly. Okay, and I apologize to you for this, but I didn't have this viewpoint in the notes I sent you. But what do you think about the divine timelessness viewpoint? This is sometimes called the Thomistic viewpoint because it was the one advanced by Thomas Aquinas, where the idea of this is we can resolve this problem of divine foreknowledge by saying God sits outside of time, and that somehow resolves the problem. And the usual critique I've heard of that is, well, the problem, if there is one, is causally related, and you don't solve this by just removing time from the equation, because you can think of all kinds of causal relations that time doesn't affect, where there's still a causal relation even if you do or do not have time. Like, think of a dog that sits on a pillow from infinity past. Well, he's causing the depression in the pillow from infinity past. You don't need time for that to be caused.
I don't. I particularly did not care for we call it classical theism,
Mm-hmm.
the Thomist view, and those before him and who took the same view. I'm not. It doesn't appeal to me. For one, I couldn't make sense of it. I mean, what does that even look like? I mean, how is it that just because God's outside of time, that therefore he has foreknowledge? Well, what does that mean? Is it like those old film strips? Remember they used to be on the reels,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
the projectors? Does that mean it's like God has this reel laying out in front of him and he just sees all of it? I mean, then that's kind of like this weird B theory of time, which I don't adhere to, and of course that would take us outside our conversation here in our topic. But I don't adhere to that, so that's a problem. I'm an atheist, that we call it. I think there's temporal becoming, and there's a real past and there's a real future that hasn't happened yet. So
yeah, I agree with you there, and from my limited knowledge, I think most
I have
Thomists
no
are
idea.
atheists too.
Yeah, I have no idea how to even think of Thomist view of foreknowledge. I mean, I don't even know what it means. To me, I was just like, is this like God's viewing the future? Certainly that's not what Thomas means. Certainly, I would think as a classical theist, I like a lot of Thomism, not everything, but some. I don't think Thomas would say that. I don't think that's what he's getting at. I would think that somehow, because God is eternal, he just has all this knowledge, right? But exactly how that plays out with free will and everything, I don't know. I mean, I never could make a whole lot of sense of it. Some people have said it's like this divine simultaneity, like everything's all happening at once. But I don't. I think that's probably a mischaracterization or a straw man. I think that's probably a misunderstanding what Thomas is trying to get at. Because I mean, how can anybody make any sense of that? I don't think Thomas is that silly,
No, he's an extremely sophisticated philosopher.
Yeah, I don't think he would be thinking of it in that way. So I think a lot of the open theists who criticize him on that particular point are missing what he's saying. Now, that's not to say I understand exactly what he's getting at, but I definitely don't think he's saying that. And so I don't even really understand exactly how it's possible to have foreknowledge, except just to say he intrinsically has it on a classical theist view. And so I think we're still left with, how does he interact with the world based on divine timelessness? So now we actually have a different problem. And so I think you're right. I think what you initially said about just because you take time out of the equation, that doesn't solve the foreknowledge and human freedom problem.
Yeah, yeah, that's the general critique I've heard of it, and I have a couple of friends who are Thomists because I got my master's degree from a Catholic seminary, so I'm trying to get some of them to come on and present the
Mhm.
divine timelessness problems from their perspective. So we'll see how they respond. But yeah, that's I almost think if you were going to go that direction, you'd almost have to take a B theory of time to
Yeah,
make
I
it
would almost think
work
so
at
too.
all.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
for
yeah.
people who don't understand, the A theory of time is essentially that time proceeds kind of in the commonsensical sense. People are born, they die, things come into being, they go out of being, things come into existence, they go out of existence. Where the B theory of time is everything kind of exists simultaneously, like the
All your
way a
science
ruler
fiction
exists
movies.
simultaneously. There's a start and an
Yep.
end to the ruler, but it all exists at once. And
Well,
would you?
all your science fiction movies are that way.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Because
The
you can time travel.
Flash,
Mhm.
yeah, Back to the Future, all of them are that way.
Mhm.
So if you were to go to the future, you could like watch yourself do things,
Yeah, yeah. And if
because
the
you're there, Yeah.
And the only way we'll ever be able to time travel is if the B theory of time is correct. And if the A theory is correct, then you can't do that
No,
because the future doesn't exist yet and the past is gone. You just
right,
can't
right.
go there. So,
Yeah, exactly. And unless, of course, you decided to go into outer space, like travel to Mars and then move, and then travel back to Earth, and you sort of experience time differently, so it feels like you went way into the future. But you can't go back.
yeah, yeah. I've heard some physicists talk about this, and one guy came up with an idea where he thought you might be able to bend time in such a way that you might be able to go back in time, but you would only be able to do it like he was going to create like a huge superconductor device, but you would only be able to do it to the point where he started the device. That was the limitation of his theory, and I didn't understand the physics enough to know whether or not that was a good theory. But
Yeah, I haven't
uh,
even heard of that one. I only heard of the one that you could actually do the future. So
well, yeah, he kind of took the one where you can, in a certain sense, travel forward in time if you accelerate to like the speed of light, because
right.
um, that's just physics. Everyone around you will be aging faster, and so
Hmm.
he kind of extrapolated from that and found a way where he thinks you could maybe take that principle and make it work backwards, but it would only work to the point where he initially turned his machine on, so to speak.
Yeah,
If
yeah.
if he's
Interesting.
right, and yeah,
Yeah,
it was an interesting theory, but I don't know enough about the physics of it to say
yeah.
whether or not because this guy. Well, this is off topic, but it's a documentary I watched on Hulu where this guy his dad died when he was a real young kid, and he was always really sad about that. And he actually got into theoretical physics and got a doctorate and all kinds of stuff in it, with the full sole purpose of researching time to see if he could find a way to go back and save his dad from dying, which
Oh,
is
wow.
yeah, and he
Interesting.
even said in the documentary, I was very, very careful to never tell anybody that this was my goal until I got tenure.
Oh, wow. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but it was I don't remember the name of the documentary or I'd plug it, but it was an interesting little story about that where the guy seemed really genuine that was his whole purpose, and he devoted his whole academic education to that, and quite astonishingly, I don't know, cool or something. So
Yeah, yeah. Very
okay,
interesting.
well, that's a little bit of a tangent, but you'd mentioned this one before. What do you think of the simple foreknowledge view? And the way I've heard that characterized is, well, God really just does know what's going to happen, but he can't really do anything about it. He's knows what's going to happen, but he's causally effete at this. It's as I've heard it described, it sounds like the character Dr. Manhattan from the Watchmen comics or the movie, where he sees the future and the character Dr. Manhattan anyway sees the future and the past simultaneously, but it's extremely deterministic. He can't do anything about it. He sees his own choices in the future, but he just knows they're going to happen, and that's it. He's just another cog in a giant machine, even though he
Mm.
sees everything that's going to happen. And that's how I've heard simple foreknowledge explained. And the obvious problem I have with that is, well, as a Christian philosopher, theologian, even a Christian at all, you want to say, well, God can intervene. So,
Yeah, yeah. Well, when you look at, I see that obviously as a problem. It's sort of like a weird distorted deism, isn't it? I don't know.
yeah, yeah,
Like a
it would be,
pseudo deism or something. I don't know.
yeah,
Kind of weird.
yeah, it would be very deistic view. That's a good way to characterize it. A very
Yeah,
watchmaker God. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And certainly, I would not ascribe that to Arminius himself. I don't think he would necessarily say it that way. But certainly, I would think that is the logical conclusion or outcome from that particular view. But one of the main things that I actually have problems with in regard to the traditional Arminian view of simple foreknowledge is basically God does not even have counterfactual knowledge. I mean, he doesn't know what people would do if they were found in certain circumstance X, Y, or Z. And that was one of the rubs with Molina. Molina discusses that, and he's like, no, God has all knowledge. If he doesn't have this knowledge, then, he's not God. And so, and it's the foundation to, obviously, Molinism's understanding of foreknowledge is middle knowledge, but in traditional Arminianism or simple foreknowledge, you don't have that. All you have is the possibilities and then what will happen, and that's all you have. And if we do that, you also have biblical problems, right? I mean, Jesus talked about, if you had existed when Jonah preached in Nineveh, you would have repented or whatever,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, how would Jesus know that? I mean, that's crazy,
Yeah.
So obviously, I think God does have that kind of a knowledge, and so I think that discounts and discredits, for me anyway, this sort of simple foreknowledge view, as well as the other thing that you mentioned. So.
Yeah, the only way I think you could make sense of this view is you'd basically have to say every single thing that's ever happened, God baked it in at the very, very first moment of creation. You'd have to make it even more deterministic than like a Reformed theology viewpoint.
Oh, yeah.
Where you would even go to the point where like the miracles that we've seen happen, like say the parting of the Red Sea, that we think God was inserting his finger into the world and interacting somehow. He wasn't actually doing that. He just set it up so it looked like that was what was happening, but it really wasn't.
Well, yeah. I mean, at best, could you have possibly? It's just like you recorded a play, and now you're just showing the play, right? I mean,
yeah.
Where you set it up all at the beginning to happen a certain way, and now it's just unfolding, right?
Yeah.
I mean, at best, that's probably what you could get. Maybe, I don't know. I haven't necessarily thought all the way through, but
as I go through this, that's the one viewpoint that I find has the least appeal to me. I can see with most of the other ones how they make sense to some people, but this is the one where I'm like, I just don't get the appeal of this one at all. But hopefully I'll get somebody on who can advocate for it, and I'll see what they have to say. So I'm looking for it.
I don't know if the traditional standard view is an Arminius view is I don't know if there's really a whole lot of people out there. I know there's probably some, but
I found a couple of essays where people have written about it, but some of them are kind of old, so I don't know. If you find anybody who has that view, send them my way. I'd love to have them on the podcast to try to talk about it, because
that'd be great. I'd love to hear it.
Exactly. Okay. Well, you read through the viewpoint that I've been kind of playing with, that I gave in the first podcast where I introduced this problem, where I kind of said, well, look, if you just define free will and define knowledge in ways that are careful, you're going to see that there isn't really a problem here, because if we assume that divine knowledge is like human knowledge in that they're similar in nature, then it's kind of hard to see how there's a conflict, because of like similar examples we talked about beforehand. The fact that your wife is going to choose lasagna, there's no conflict there. The fact that people, when I was in my 20s, people knew I would get coffee at a gas station, well, there's no conflict there. Now, if you want to go the other route and assume that because God is God and we're not, there's something radically different about the way he knows things, about his knowledge, whatever it is, that divine epistemology is so radically different, then you can't really say there's a problem, because you don't even know what the nature of it is. So you told me you'd read through that. What did you think about that viewpoint that I outlined? And for people who are just listening to us now, I gave that in detail in the introductory podcast I did to the Problem of Divine Foreknowledge.
Yeah, I think that's a good beginning as a possible response. I would probably use that in addition to Molinism. And what I mean by that is I would probably say, look, God is so infinite and radically different because he's an uncreated being that understanding the nature of his knowledge is going to be radically different than how our knowledge is. Our knowledge is ever growing. His isn't. He has it all at once. I mean, even if I look at Molinism, how is it that God has natural knowledge, mental knowledge, and free knowledge? How is it that he has all that? In fact, no view really discredits that except open theism and the traditional Arminian simple foreknowledge view. All of the other views say, yeah, that God's got this natural free will or free knowledge and then mental knowledge. I can't even grasp what that means. I mean, how is it that he holds all that together at once and has all of it? I mean, I have no idea. So I think there's an appeal to that for me as a partial explanation. And I guess what I mean is I would use that to sort of punt to. Okay. Because, Molinism isn't helping you and you can't understand it. So, well, think of it this way. Our knowledge is radically different than God's knowledge, and we're never going to really totally grasp it. But one thing we need to understand is that we need to affirm free will, and we need to affirm God's knowledge of free will choices of the future. The scriptures do that, I think, and so based upon that alone, we should accept it. Whether we can make sense of it or not, well, that's another question, right? I think Molinism does the best at this point in time, unless something better comes along. But that's what I would do. The reason why I say it that way, at least at this point presently, is because when I try to teach students about the Trinity, obviously, can we really truly grasp the Trinity? Well, no, I don't think so. Can we understand it or conceive of it and make sense of it in the sense that it's not a logical contradiction? Well, yeah, I think so. But to grasp it, get our minds around it, I doubt it. I doubt we'll ever do that. And what I say usually on the heels of that to my students is, and the reason why is because God exists in a radically different way than I exist. And everything that we've ever experienced, because I am created, he's uncreated. Do you know anything uncreated outside of God? No. Have you ever experienced anything uncreated outside of God? No. Well, then how in the world can we grasp something infinite? And I mean, it's just beyond.
God has to kind of be in his own category.
He's in his own category. So I would use your explanation in the similar way in regard to foreknowledge, free will, and things like that.
That's kind of funny that you're like, say, that's a good start, or you're at least sympathetic to it, because when I asked Tim the Reformed Calvinistic perspective on this, he was like, yeah, I like your response. I've got no problem with that.
Yeah.
So,
well, I think, from my vantage point, this is how I would say it. I think if we're going to be honest, truthful Christians and be real, we need to say, trying to grasp the true nature of God and how this all fits together, I don't think we're ever really, truly going to entirely grasp it, I think that's why we have these models. I think they're good ways to think of it. I think there are some, in some ways, there are best explanations, It doesn't mean it's the truth of the matter. I'm not going to sit here and say, well, I think Molinism is the truth of the matter. I can't say that. I just think it's the best explanation of the matter, but I can't say it's the truth of the matter, right? So, now if you were to ask me, did Jesus rise from the dead? Well, that's best explanation, and that's the truth of the matter,
Yeah, I get you.
So,
it's like what you're saying. Are you familiar with the Aquinas' doctrine of analogy? Have you read about that?
That's exactly what I was actually thinking in my head when I was saying it. Yeah.
I've come across that
analogically here, right?
Yeah. That's for people who aren't familiar. Aquinas said that you could only speak of God by analogy. You couldn't speak of him univocally, meaning you couldn't speak of him as is, because he's so radically different, so other than we are. So God is love with a capital L, but we can only speak of like love in the remote, very obscure senses that we do when compared to God. So it's only analogous language. And
But there's also touch points of reality to it, though. I mean, And I want to make sure your listeners understand that we're not saying that it's so that there's all we can do is say it's kind of like that. No, there is some real touch points here where we can actually experience goodness of God.
Hmm.
It's just if we try to define goodness or understand goodness in its totality, we can't. We can't entirely grasp it, and it's that way with everything with God. There's just an analogy that we have to sort of have in our minds, if you will.
Yeah, and I've kind of gone back and forth on that because I can find some philosophical problems with the doctrine of analogy that I've
Well,
talked
yeah,
about. But at the same time, I'm like, well, but even so, there's a good point there that God is
yeah,
radically different than we
yeah,
are. And even if I want it to be said a little bit of a different way, or I want to nuance it a little different way, there's still a good point there that we'd all do
yeah.
well to keep in mind. So
Yeah, I think there's an essence there that Thomas gives us that is true, and that I think
exactly,
we
yeah,
have to
yeah.
latch on to. Yeah.
Okay. Well, why don't do you have any resources you would recommend people look at for if they want
Yeah.
to learn more about Molism, books, lectures,
I,
or anything like that?
yeah, absolutely. I've referred to a couple already, but these are
Hmm.
I'm just going to highlight three, and a couple of them I already referred to. But the biggest one would be The Only Wise God by William Lane Craig. He does a great job dealing with all the aspects of theological fatalism and Molinism and things like that. Now, again, it's a very thin book, but it's dense. It's dense. Um, Probably a better book, if you want sort of a primer, would be a more recent book by Kirk McGregor. It's called Louis de Molina, and the subtitle is The Life and Theology of the Founder of Middle Knowledge. And it's a fantastic book. You get more than the explanation of middle knowledge. You also get his ethics, and also what's kind of interesting for me, even as a philosopher, is in that book he deals a little bit with Molina's thoughts on early capitalism. So I thought that was kind of
Oh,
cool.
okay,
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah. So you could almost see him as sort of a progenitor to capitalism, modern capitalism, anyway. Anyway, then the third one, if you're really wanting to get deep and understand, you would go to the horse's mouth, so to speak, which is Louis de Molina's work called On Divine Foreknowledge.
Hmm.
It's part 4 of his Concordia. And if you go online and try to find it, it's very difficult to find. And if you do find it, it's going to cost you because Molinism is pretty popular anymore these days, and in especially evangelicalism.
Yeah,
And so
definitely.
that book is hard to find, and if you can find it, it's very expensive because it's in high demand. So.
Oh, they haven't put Molina's works online for free by chance, have they? Do you
I have
know?
not found any. Now
Okay.
that's not to say that they're not on there. I don't know of any presently, but I haven't done any recent research in that area to know if there is anything out there for free. So
Okay. Sometimes with those philosophers and theologians from the Middle Ages, you can find that, but sometimes you can't because it usually has to be translated, and then somebody wants to obviously get paid for the translation.
right.
So,
As far as
okay.
I know, the part 4 of the Concordia, which is Molina's discussion on foreknowledge and free will, that's the only part of the Concordia that's actually been translated.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
yeah, as far as I understand, that's the only part. I may be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure.
Okay, good deal. All right. Well, lastly, do you got any? Well, you mentioned a few of them at the start, but do you got any projects or things going on now that you'd want to plug? You know, let some of my listeners know what you got going on.
Well, no, not presently because I really don't haven't landed a publisher yet, and I don't
Hmm.
like to advertise or anything
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
if I don't haven't landed a publisher yet. So I'm still in the doing that presently. I'm doing a co-authored work right now, more in the area of evangelism and apologetics, so more of a practical ministry kind of book, if you will.
Hmm.
And then I'm actually writing a fantasy book
Oh, cool.
that incorporates a lot of philosophy and worldview type issues. I've wanted to do that for a long time, and actually I've been working on it for like 3 years now. I'm hoping to get it done this year, and I haven't landed a publisher for that yet. And then I also have some other theological and philosophical articles and works that I'm working on, so hopefully will come to fruition in the next year or so.
Okay. Well, yeah. If you get any of those published or land a publisher and want to like promote them or something, let me know, and I'll be sure to let people know.
Oh, awesome!
And you do run that podcast and blog called The Blade, right?
That's right. I have just temporarily suspended it till probably later this year because of the writing projects. I'm trying to get those done. But there are a lot of podcasts and blogs on there right now. So if anybody's interested, you can go on there and search. I've got different topics I deal with. I deal with political philosophy. I deal with theology. I deal with Molinism, all sorts of different things.
Well, it's exactly what I try and do here. Deal with all different sorts of things. Do practical philosophy of religion. I do tend to gravitate toward philosophy of religion because I enjoy it, but yeah, all kinds of different things. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we've kind of just run through all my notes. Do you have any closing thoughts or anything else you want to say?
No, I just want to thank you for having me on, Phil. I really appreciate it. I've enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you coming on. I really enjoyed it too. Okay. Well, so that's going to wrap up our podcast for this time. Write in and let me know what you think. Tell me what you think about Molinism, what you like, don't like. Do you think we covered all the objections? Just write in and let me know. You can reach me at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com. And I also started a Facebook group that you can reach me at. That's The Examined Life with Phil. And if you like what I'm doing here on the podcast, be sure to share it and let other people hear about it. So thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again next week.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.